A very good afternoon to all of you. On behalf of the Department of Film Studies, the Bhawanipur Education Society College, and Lumiere, the BESC Film Club, I welcome you all to our year-long celebration of Satyajit Ray's birth centenary, A Century of Ray. Lumiere is a collaborative body with film enthusiasts across teachers and students from different disciplines of the college. Today's special lecture inaugurates a year-long initiative taken up by the Film Studies Department and the Film Club to commemorate eminent figure Satyajit Ray's birth centenary year. Through this celebration, Ray's eclectic contribution and achievements across cinema, literature, art, music, design will be remembered and reappraised. Without taking much time, I will now request Mr. Arup Ratan Samajdar, the convener of the event, to take over the next sessions. Over to you, Arupda.
Thank you, Ruktima. It is indeed an exciting moment for us, and we are proud and honored to have Dr. Anindya Sengupta with us today. But before we proceed with the lecture, I'd kindly request our respected teacher in charge, Dr. Suchandra Chakraborty, to deliver a welcome note. Ma'am, if you please say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Arup. It is really a pleasure for me to welcome Dr. Anindya Sengupta in this maiden venture of Film Studies Department and Lumiere, our film club. It's indeed a really commendable initiative that you have taken, and I wish that even in spite of the challenges faced during these circumstances, that you have a very good celebratory year. Satyajit Ray, of course, is someone who is familiar to all of us and someone we all look up to. In fact, there is a photo of Satyajit Ray taken by Nimai Ghosh, which captures him amidst a sea of people. But literally standing head and shoulders above the milling crowds around him. Looking at it, I thought that this image is probably emblematic of the position that Ray holds in the Bengali imagination. To most of us, Ray represents the essence of a modernity in Bengal that is eclectic and diverse. He came from a family which stands out, and the image of tallness again creeps in. The family stands out for their inventiveness in both science and the arts. Ray displayed that trait at its full bloom. In taking his place among the stalwarts of world cinema, Ray's aesthetics combined the quotidian with the poetic, a trait which touched his works with magic, but at the same time kept them rooted in the real world, which is probably why they still have an abiding interest for us. And what I said about his cinema is probably true of his writing, of his design, of most of the things that he touched with his genius. I often feel that the iconic photograph of him looking through his camera actually captures this essential characteristic of his wide oeuvre. A centenary being an occasion to look back in order to look ahead is therefore an ideal opportunity to rewind, retrospect, and maybe reimagine a number of things. Has Ray's legacy survived only in pale imitations of the quote-unquote look of his movies? What is his actual legacy? The body of his work or the spirit of confident innovation that made him go beyond the formulaic? What happens when two creative imaginations meet in the cinematic renditions of literary works, For instance, when Ray adapts Tagore. So, what happens then? How does new technology affect older forms of movie making? I think these and many other questions will surely come up in the course of the centenary celebrations. And so I welcome this maiden venture of the two arms of the college, a department and a film club, for organizing the celebrations. And I hope that it will actually ignite young minds to think more, to come up with new ideas and not just imitations. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for those words of encouragement and inspiration and kindness too. Your words are always valued for your insight and also for your brevity, I must add. And now I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our guest speaker, Dr. Anindya Sengupta. Dr. Sengupta teaches at the Department of Film Studies, Jadavpur University, where he is also currently serving as the head of the department. His doctoral thesis, titled Politics of Criticism Satyajit Ray as an Indian Author, deals with an extensive reassessment of the Ray scholarship. In 2017, he had also published his first work of fiction, a sci-fi novel titled Aparthibo. It gives me immense joy to welcome Dr. Anindya Sengupta. Anindya, to some of us here who had the privilege to attend his classes, I'd kindly request him now to deliver his special lecture for the evening, which is titled Looking at the Apu Trilogy from 2020. Anindya, if you would please take it from here. Thank you.
Uh, um, Welcome and thank you for giving me this opportunity. Bhawanipur Education Society College, Department of Film Studies, and Lumiere, that is the BESC Film Club. Thank you. And I think that Suchanda marvelously summed up the concerns which should come up during the centenary celebration of Satyajit Ray. I don't know if I can actually do justice to all these questions. Actually, she summed it up so brilliantly. But oh well, let's begin and let's start. And a word of disclaimer, just a day before yesterday, I also presented another kind of webinar, which was a public webinar, which was viewed on the YouTube. And I kind of designed these two lectures as a kind of volume 1 and volume 2. So anyone who actually heard the earlier webinar might actually initially might find that I'm repeating, but I'm considering that many of you didn't actually listen to it, but the bulk of the talk which I'm going to present will not concern the earlier lecture, but the beginning premise is actually similar. If you look at the title, of my lecture, Looking at Apu Trilogy from 2020, I didn't actually, I wrote 2020, but I didn't actually say during the centenary year of Ray, because to me, the time becomes a main concern here now, and I think it will be evident in my lecture also. That is 20. How will we remember 2020? Will we remember it as Satyajit Ray's birth centenary year, or will we remember as a year of a pandemic, that is the COVID pandemic, which most probably even the most elderly among us, among the listeners today, most probably even they can't actually recall any event of this sort, of this scale, a global pandemic as such. So in a way, if we think of 2020 as a signifier, then down history, it will kind of overwrite uh, that this is the centenary year of Satyajit Ray, with this signified that it was the year of the corona uh, corona 19 or COVID pandemic. And therefore, what comes to our mind is that when I'm delivering this lecture, am I going to deny this new meaning of this year, this new meaning of this year? And can I actually look at Rai, look at it within 2020, from 2020? And therefore, we should kind of recall that what 2020 means to us, and how from 2020, Apu Trilogy, I'm concerned mainly about Apu Trilogy and the first film, that is Pather Pacheli, how it becomes meaningful to us in a new kind of way, might be. So one can say that this is a kind of experimental lecture, in a sense that uh, if you remember the term experimental, that is experimental, and this experimental is a term which is often used in cinema. We talk about experimental films, and where it's most often in common parlance, in journalistic parlance, it is not actually properly kind of used, the word, the term experimental. Experimental means a kind of experiment which one is not sure about the results which it will yield. And so I think my lecture is also experimental in the sense that it might fail and it might be successful, in the sense that I might actually give you a perspective of looking at Apu Trilogy from 2020 and not 2019. And in that sense, there is another premise of this lecture, that most probably in 2020, we are in a different paradigm of time altogether. And we have actually passed another paradigm of times might be, and where the making meaning of certain things, like a film like Pather Pacheli, or a trilogy like Apu Trilogy, or a figure or an institution like Satyajit Ray, where the yardsticks of making meaning of this artworks and the artists and so on and so forth, the known yardsticks might be actually might be that of the earlier paradigm. So in that sense, we are, when we discuss about Rai, we might be discussing him, evaluating him, appreciating him in a paradigm which is not of our time. That is the time which begins in roughly in 2019-20 and begins to an earlier time. And this is more true when we are celebrating the centenary of a figure like Rai. So if you think that just a couple of days ago, it was the 65th anniversary of the release of Pather Pacheli, then when we appreciate Pather Pacheli, what are we doing? Are we going back in time? Are we going back into 1955 and understanding what the event was like during that moment? Or are we looking at that time from the time we belong to? And I think I will try to address this thing, that how the films, if not Rai the figure himself, how this trilogy particularly, it can gain new meaning, and it can make help us to kind of to assess the world we live in also. And saying that, I wish to actually go back to what Rai meant to people during this last 50 or 60 years or so. And I will today refer to two writings on Rai which are rather uncommon, and I will highlight the uncommonness of these two writings. These two writings are not by Bengali writers on Ray. commentators on Ray, and they are also not from very known commentators on Ray from the West. These are two writings by two rather unknown names. One is Paul Glushanok, but before Paul Glushanok, I will go to an article written by John Floss, and let me try to share the screen now. Is the screen visible?
Yes, we can see. Thank you.
We can see. Yeah. Okay. So this is an article by John Floss, and the URL of the article, I can actually present it to you in the chat box for your perusal later. I'm presenting the URL in the chat box so you can look at it. And this article, it appeared in 1968. Now, 1968 is a very momentous year in the history of cinema, because 1968 was the year of the May uprising in Paris, the student, youth, and workers uprising in Paris, which almost made France the next socialist European nation, European state actually. And all the 10 years of very autocratic General de Gaulle's state government, it was almost on the verge of falling down. The rebellion, the uprising was actually curbed very violently, but May 68 became another momentous year in the history of in the history of 20th century as such. And incidentally, interestingly, this essay was first published in 5th May-June 1968. And here, John Floss, he appreciates Ray in a language which becomes very interesting to us now, because if you kind of translate this entire essay into Bangla, then it might actually appear as a kind of overwhelmingly overwhelmed, a kind of overwhelmed writing on Ray, which many would say that it's not critical enough. And here I've highlighted few places, but there are few places which I wish to share with you. And I will start from the end. Essentially, and this, I am reading out this highlighted phrase passages. Essentially, the art of Satyajit Ray lies not in the formal properties and technical assurance of his work. Others can surpass him in that his preeminence lies in having an unerring eye to simulate behavior. He is not deluded into transplanting stereotypes of behavior and character into his scenes, as so many film and stage directors are, and an exquisitely refined sense of relevance in his selection of what to simulate. So what does he simulate? He's not simulating stereotypes. So most probably he's simulating something which is real. And the last line is like this, and he's motivated by the last great challenge to the artist to make the commonplaces of existence yield up their meaning. I'll request you to remember this phrase, to make the commonplace of existence yield up their meaning. The meaning of the commonplace is yielded by the commonplace of existence itself and not by the artist. The artist facilitates, the artist kind of facilitates something, and reality expresses it. Let's move to another passage. It is my contention that the cinema of Satyajit Ray, especially in Pather Pachali and in varying lesser degrees in later films, exemplifies an aesthetic innovation, the contemplation of the emotive properties of life represented without the mediation of formal beauty. I realize this claim overreaches. Formal properties are never entirely dispensed with. However, the extent to which reliance on them can be reduced to cinema is unique. So here comes another point, that in Satyajit Ray's films, we have a dimension of contemplation, and this dimension of contemplation is achieved by a minimal use of formal properties of cinema. And he says that formal properties of cinema can never be just erased off. It will be always there. But here, the formal properties, the minimal formal properties of cinema, it is, I'm sorry, someone's, there is a feedback most probably. Formal properties of the cinema, I think someone should, thank you. Someone should mute the mic. That the formal properties of cinema, in a way, it. Okay. Anyhow, I'm keeping this headphone down. The formal properties of cinema, it does not actually hinder the contemplative mode. Rather, the contemplative mode is enhanced by the formal properties of cinema. Let's go back to another kind of passage from John Floss's article. He says that to a great extent, Pather Pachali is able to immerse us in the flux of experience without the mediation of aesthetic conventions. So again, aesthetics, formal properties, they don't come in between. They don't make their presence felt as such. The thing we respond to the film, nature, people, their feelings and their relationships are encountered and evaluated along lines of inference operative in life rather than in art. Now, this is a very interesting kind of observation. That is the way we make meaning in life, and that's how we make meaning in Satyajit Ray's films also. Rather, the making meaning or making inferences, the way we make inferences in art, that takes a kind of backseat. And he goes on, in what can the beauty of such an artifact lie? It has no conventional form, no conditioning structure of aesthetic sensibility. There are no schemata to call our imagination into play. There is no dream work. But there is still contemplation. For no matter how far the depiction may become indistinguishable from the event, the viewer is always exempt from the need to act. Art removes us to the plane of contemplation as distinct from the plane of decision and execution. I will just go back to the final. This is the penultimate quotation, because I like it in that sense. He talks about the moment of Pather Pachali, and he says that the critics generally had been embarrassed with Pather Pachali's victory over global cinema, as well as the clods who professed boredom. There were aesthetes who had no jargon in their armory to make something so uneventful, so artistically self-effacing. So the critical jargon was at loss, saying something as kind of impactful like Pather Pachali. And then comes an interesting sarcastic kind of comment. The social content boys and social content girls also might be are looming large in 2020's world too, where we think that art will be about a strong content as such. The social content boys were uneasy about a message that took no explicit stand, yet communicate values by the very capture of the viewer's discerned empathy. The value themselves acclaimed a positive warmth in human relationship, but they did so without a protest. And now I'm going to the final kind of this final quotation from John Claus, and this is rather very poetic, and he compares Rai with the other auteurs, other great auteurs of Western cinema. And the way he writes it is very, very interesting. The four horsemen of guilt, alienation, dominance, possessiveness has visited upon us and our institutions. The well springs of our art have been poisoned. Only by great vigilance can we continue to believe in ourselves, much less in others. Our art forms reflect the idea of suffering as issuing from the conflict as being willed. Our literary systems incorporate the concept of evil, where there is suffering, blame, and punishment at measures in aesthetic skills. And then he names certain auteurs, which becomes very interesting. The masters of Western cinema are compelled to examine, if not endorse, the anguish of futility, and he keeps in bracket Antonioni. Antonioni's film does this. Irresponsibility, Godard. Insularity, Olo Rene. Professionalism, Howard Hawks. Retribution, Hitchcock. And aggression by Siegel and Fuller. The position may yet be retrieved by the new filmmakers, but the condition of established artists is not encouraging. Ford means John Ford, Lang, that is Fritz Lang, and Buñuel, they are now silent. Visconti, Demi, and Vadim are being seduced by formalism. Fellini by narcissism. De Sica has sold out. Louis Malle, Rossi, and Lozzi have lost their bearings. Only Truffaut and Milos Forman, François Truffaut and Milos Forman, can express a positive spirit without going on the defensive. And then he pitches Shotritra against them. In Shotritra's vision of the world, compassion is not a reaction to something else, not a redress to fear, horror, and cruelty. It is itself a primary unconditioned motivation. So what is the primary unconditioned motivation? The world of compassion. And let's to combat this entire essay by John Claus. It sounds very kind of quaint these days, and most probably we have stopped discussing art in these terms, and therefore what seems to interesting to me is that when John Claus was writing this on 1968, written during May 1968, to whom Shotritra is becoming such a valuable artist, he's already writing from a position which is not even dominant in the Western cinema. So it was recessive in Western cinema, because he is pitching Rai against more fashionable or more renowned auteurs, and saying that how Rai has certain values which are even lost in those kind of auteurs. And now I will share with you another essay by Paul Glushanok. And I think I'm being visible now. And Paul Glushanok, who also writes less poetically, but from a kind of similar kind of position. And I'm reading a small passage from here, the passage I've highlighted. Everything in Ray's films is so subtly implied. He never hits over the head with the kind of heavy-handed cop-out symbolism that Antonioni used. Again, the comparison comes. Each important element in a Ray film, an idea, motive, or concept, is usually introduced in a way that at first seems quite incidental. It will then be developed as an undercurrent throughout the film, and will subtly recede to give way to other elements as they come into prominence, and those in turn will give way to more, and none of these threads are ever lost. They flow simultaneously throughout the film, intertwining contrapuntally, rather like the voice lines of a Bach fugue. And Ray is the conductor, bringing up the bass here, and softening the soprano there. And at the end, the elements come together and result in what is usually a kind of revelation. I cannot think of a filmmaker whose endings have such an impact, and there is no reason for a shock and sudden realization. Everything was there, it was all there for us to see throughout the film. And if we come back, this essay also is a kind of celebration of Ray, and it polemically kind of compares Ray with other great authors. And Glushanov is very harsh on Godard, Antonioni, and so on and so forth. And here also, the way he has to fight out his contention that Ray is a better filmmaker than all these Western filmmakers, it's something which becomes interesting to us because we understand that he is also on the backside. That is, he knows that, and this essay was also, if I share with you the date, again, it was written in 1967. So it was 67, 68 when few critiques of Western from the West, they're celebrating Rai for something, for a sensibility, for a mode, which was on the recession, which was receding even then in the West. And if you look back to the history of cinema in the West, we know that 1960s was the period of the second wave of modernism. If you think that the 20s was the first wave of modernism, then the 1960s and the fag end of the 1960s was a period of the second wave of modernism, when a kind of Brechtian sensibility was dominant in cinema, in the art cinema of those times, and a kind of post-colonial, proactively revolutionary cinema, a proactively political cinema was also prominent during those days in the Western hemisphere of the globe of cinema. And at that time, here is this two critics who is saying that Rai's cinema has something valuable which is now on the verge of going away because our sensibilities have changed. And there is a sense of regret in these two writings, which says that the West is actually losing a certain kind of cinema of which Rai is the last champion, a kind of cinema which emerged after the wars, that is during the 1940s and 50s, when realism was valued. So a kind of realism is going away. So in this lecture, what I want to do is I want to talk about this realist gesture.
It seems there has been some technical issues on the end of the speaker. We'll try to contact him and be back shortly.
In the meantime, yes, Tathagata sir, thank you for reminding us. I would request the audience to put forth all your questions in the chat box, and we'll address them after the lecture in the Q&A session.
Yes, sorry everyone, but there was actually a power failure on the end of the speaker, but it has been restored and Dr. Sengupta will be, and yeah, he has joined again. Thank you. Thank you for bearing with us. Anindya, you are on mute. We can't hear you.
Okay, thankfully we are back again, and there was a power failure in my locality, in my house. So thankfully it was very short. So I'm back. We are back again. So I I left it during the moment when I was talking about this realist gesture. Now, what this realist gesture might mean in today's terms, and what was the kind of recessive sensibility, if you can think about it, that once the modernist second wave of modernism becomes so kind of dominant in the Western cinema. What did these two writers, what did they feel? There's something which was actually going kind of in the recessive. And let's try to understand here now that what was this peculiar kind of realism which Rai was trying to understand. And I will try to understand this realism with a kind of binary which is very much in vogue now. That is during our times of pandemic. Often when we talk about politics, mainly politics or political art, one can say, or even political art, or even a kind of socially responsible art, we talk about the reality being out there. Now, this is today. This will be my key point: the reality being out there. Now, what is this out there? And I mean, one has in Bengali, one has often heard in a very excited kind of voice that you are a ivory tower discussant on reality, but the reality is out there on the streets. Reality is out there in the field. Comrade, একটু রাস্তায় নামুন, একটু মাঠে নেমে দেখুন, go to the fields, go to the streets or something. And when one sees that, immediately a valuation is kind of made, and immediately a kind of binary is being set up. A binary, that is, when someone says this, that there is a reality out there, immediately a kind of demarcation, a line is drawn, a demarcation is made, and one says that there is an inside and there is an outside. And reality is out there. Reality is not in here. So these are my these are my binaries: out there and in here. And we know that during this moment of the pandemic, our life is also divided into these two spatialities, the in and the out. and we are locked in our house, and our out is precarious. The coronavirus is spreading high, it's spreading out there, and it's spreading actually to be inside. So we are protecting our insides from the outsides, one can say. Let me dwell on this binary as we understand it now. And we actually, if you think, we know what actually is at stake. Like my life partner, who is a feminist, she sometimes she regrets how that the outside to a woman, this outside, the outer world, is something which a woman, a Bengali woman, one can say, and the global woman also, through the last 100 years or so, this is the outside which one has fought enough, struggled to fought enough to lay their claims on. So suddenly this outside going away is not a happy sign. On the other hand, we see that often and this is something symptomatically I have noticed among men, among Bengali men, how they are feeling trapped inside. And when they are feeling trapped, bored inside, then one actually understands that how the home or the inside had actually no value to this men. Actually, they don't know what is the value of this space. So this in and out is something which we are dealing with, and one cannot be very kind of make a black and white division that the out is kind of good or in is bad, or in is good or out is bad. But in and out and a demarcation in between is something which we are kind of feeling every day in our situation. And there we can recall that often when one is talking about a political art, when one is talking about realist art, one says that the reality is out there. Now, Satyajit, discussing Satyajit's films in these terms is very easy, and I will not take the easy mode, because if one can recall two films at least, that is Charulata and Ghore Baire, one can see that Satyajit, with the help of Rabindranath Tagore, of course, directly deals with it. And entire Charulata and Ghore Baire a bit weekly later, Charulata actually powerfully demonstrates how history and politics and modernity and social changes are happening not only out there, but also in here, inside the house. But we'll not talk about it. We'll talk about Pather Pachali, the moment of Pather Pachali here, and the thing which I am trying to describe as the realist gesture. What does this out here mean? And what does this notion of the reality being out there becomes meaningful in Pather Pachali, in Satyajit? I'm not talking only about the film, but I'm talking mainly, because we are in the centenary year of the director, I'm talking about this attempt, Rai's attempt to make a film of a new kind between 1952 and 1955, and also continuing for the later two films and forming the trilogy. Now, the out there in Apu Trilogy is very evident, because Apu Trilogy became one of the first, or Pather Pachali, one can say, Pather Pachali became one of the first films in India where extensively real location shooting on real conditions, on natural conditions, these were actually bravely kind of attempted. And when Rai was trying to shoot Pather Pachali, and you should remember that when Rai was shooting Pather Pachali, trying to complete his films, and there was large obstacles, mainly the lack of fund. He was always on the news. He was always on the news because in Taliganj, that is in Kolkata and Taliganj, the film Pada, he was always in the news because of two reasons. One, he was because he was the son of a famous figure, Sukumar Rai, and therefore he was on the news. And also because Pather Pachali is by then a classic, a classic novel. So it was much coveted upon. Many producers wanted to actually buy the copyright, which Rai managed. Thankfully, he managed to actually buy the copyright, and therefore people were watching him, and people were watching this young man, a rookie kind of filmmaker who had no experience on filmmaking, while he was trying to make a film using a method which was unheard of during those days, that is using non-professional actors. Now this idea of non-professional actors have been too overstated in case of Pather Pachali, because many actors were there on the screen who were professionals. So this eclectic kind of mix of the professional and the non-professional actors, but mainly the shooting in real location and in real life conditions, without fund, and using machineries which were rather not state of art. And I can remember that the first essay which Satyajit Ray wrote in 1948, that is What's Wrong with Indian Films. This is the first article he wrote, and he said there that and he criticizes prevalent cinema, studio-bound prevalent cinema, that this cinema has a habit of shooting indoors in a country which is all landscape, and at a time when all other countries are turning to the documentary cinema for inspiration. Indian cinema is all indoors. Indoors means studio, bound within the studio. And then at the end of the essay, he writes, the raw material of the cinema is light itself. It is incredible that a country which has inspired so much painting and music and poetry should fail to move the filmmaker. He has only to keep his eyes open and his ears let him do so. And that's what he did. He kind of kept his eyes and ears open. What exactly does this mean? Not only he went outside into locations where previously the camera didn't go, but today I will just bear with me, because I'm trying to bring back the John Floss essay again, and because I want to read one passage. I'm sharing the screen again. And I think it's visible to you. And here is a kind of long quotation with which Floss began his essay. And he says that before I made my first film, Pather Pachali, I had only a superficial knowledge of what life in a Bengali village was like. Now I know a good deal about it. I know its soil, its seasons, its trees and forests and flowers. I know how the man in the field works and how the woman at the well gossip. And I know the children out in the sun and the rain, behaving as children in all parts of the world do. My own city of Calcutta too, I know much better, that I have, here there is a typo most probably, I know it much better, that I have made a film about it. And I will be talking mainly about this idea that while you make a film, you start knowing a space, really knowing a space. You should understand that Satyajit Ray was a very cosmopolitan kind of figure. Most probably he was more Western, more British than all the listeners here today, and the speaker also, that he was more British, more Western than us. He was most probably more urban than us in the sense of sensibilities, because he was, here is a figure during the moment when cosmopolitanism, cultural cosmopolitanism was a key figure in the sensibilities. And I can't actually say the same about our days now, that cosmopolitanism is in that sense in as kind of as attractive in these days than during those days. So Rai was one can say almost a westernized and a very kind of urban figure. So when he was making Pather Pachali, he's not only going literally out there in really real locations, and now this point will be important in the rest of the part of the lecture. He was going also out of his self. This is important. That a thoroughly Western, a thoroughly urban man was going to the rural world and trying to know it. And he says that while I made the film, I knew it. Let's think about this also, and let's also recall Pather Pachali. I don't have the time to show you the showing bits and parts of the film, but I think you can recall. If you recall the film, if you recall the first few scenes of the film, the first scene of the film shows Durga, little Durga, stealing a fruit from someone's orchard. Then it shows the woman folk, that is the housewives in the 30s or 40s. They are talking about Durga, and we meet Sharbojaya. And then finally we meet a very old woman, that is Indira Thakur, in the village. And the camera, rather than making the scenes very dramatically important, it describes a way of life. So via description, this 3 or 4 cents, this cluster of 3 or 4 cents of a single afternoon, via a description of what women, the girl child, a old woman, the woman in their 30s and 40s, what they do in the village, by creating a feminine world. Rai actually in 3 to 4 scenes might be, Rai actually presents all the primary concerns of Pather Pachali, and I can say of the trilogy also, and arguably of the entire trilogy. That is the issue of the privacy, issue of poverty. The issue of privacy also comes in the scene between Sharbojaya, Indira Thakur and Durga. Privation, property, poverty, nature, alienation from nature, being one with nature, and a life of daily struggle. All primary concerns of the trilogy and of the film mainly, it actually is presented, and it's presented without a single male character introduced. And I would argue that in Pather Pachali, unlike the novel, in Pather Pachali, Apu never becomes a central figure. Apu is always the peripheral figure. Pather Pachali is mainly about Sharbojaya and Durga. And Apu comes at the center of the stage in the later 2 films, in a way. And here one should remember that Pather Pachali and Aparajito, the 2 novels, they are examples of the Bildungsroman. That is, the Bildungsroman is a typical form of 19th and early 20th century realist novel, where the growth and coming into terms of being of an individual is depicted. And it's not ironical and it's not coincidental that most often this individual, they are men, not women, because 2 important factors become very important in a Bildungsroman. One is education and another is travel. And so education and the travel being a certain kind of privilege to men, to the male child of the family. So often we see this becoming the individual and coming to be terms of what one will be, what one's vocation is in life. The depiction this centered upon the male child. And I would say what Satyajit is doing subtly following Vibhuti Bhushan, what Satyajit Ray was doing was a kind of subversive act. He was subverting the Bildungsroman form, in a sense, that where the main concerns and the main affective world, main world of sensibility of the trilogy is presented through the scenes where the women are dominant. And we will see that how this notion of two kind of modernities, the modernity of the woman in their daily struggle, if you think of Sarvojaya, and also the modernity of the man child, they also pitted together in Aparajita. We can't say that Sarvojaya is a pre-modern character. She is also a modern character in our kind of way, so on and so forth. So the outside is also the outside of the masculine self also. And Rai was doing something. And I told that he takes a little help from the novel. In the novel, this entire thing was subtle, was surreptitious, but not prominent. But he takes a little help, because if you recall the novel, that is Pather Pachali. Pather Pachali has this earlier section which was named Bollali Balai, and this entire Bollali Balai section entirely was on Indira Thakur. Her ways of being, her memories, a very unlinear time where myth, memory, and the present day gets mixed together, a different paradigm of time together, and this entire section, the entire first section ends with that famous line that Indira Thakuruner mriত্যুর সঙ্গে নিশ্চিন্দপুরে সেকালের অবসান ঘটিল. With the death of Indira Thakur, the yesteryears came to an end in Nishchindipur, and we now understand that it was actually a paradigm of time coming into end. The way we perceive time through memories, through myths, through the present, so on and so forth. Not a linear kind of time, a linear sense of time. So Rai was actually, I will say that now let's go back to the definition of out there. The out there means outside the city where filmmaking mainly took place. Out there also means out of the self, and to me this becomes important here. And we will here I will recall one important criticism of Rai, which is very much in vogue these days, not in the West, but in Bengali scholarship, that how in Rai's literature, mainly the literature he wrote, how in Rai's literature, his entire world is very masculine or male-centric, one say. There is almost no woman characters in Rai's literature, in the stories he wrote, and one tries to justify it in a certain kind of way, but the justification is very kind of feeble one way. So here we have a contradiction, and this is a contradiction I kind of love, because I don't think the artists are very kind of unified beings. I like me personally, I like finding out irresolvable contradictions within artists. That a man who is an artist, who when he is armed with the camera, he can actually portray woman powerfully, and when he is not enarmed, one can say armed with the camera, when one is left to his own imaginative devices, he can't do it. He can't actually do it in that sense. And Rai's fictional writings are almost devoid of woman characters, where in his films there are so many powerful woman characters to meet. We'll also see that Rai here is enabled. So now this is something which I want to pose as a question. What exactly is cinema doing? And I can't actually give you the answer in this lecture, but I can validate the question, that what exactly is cinema doing which enables an artist to go out of its self? And what does this going out of the self means? This minimizing of the self, a masculine, urban, Western self moving to a place which is dominantly not masculine, not urban, not Western. It is something of which these artists didn't have any experience before. A different kind of world, a different kind of space, a different kind of time, and a different kind of sensibility. How is the camera enabling is this? And here I think the camera becomes a little bad metaphor, one can say. Not bad, a kind of lesser metaphor, because if we can think of camera as a metaphor of cinema, we should also understand that the camera, that cinema also hears things. That the sound recording instrument is also there. And now I will I will share with you another beautiful passage written by Rai himself. Uh, just just allow me to find it out. Yeah. I'm sharing my screen. And here, from his kind of uh, this book, which was published just before or after his death, My Years with Apu, there's this beautiful passage. I'm reading it out. He's talking about this long period of no work between this procurement of funds, when there was nothing to do, there was no funds, and one cannot actually shoot. And one actually is very depressed once the anxiety level reaches high and one is actually depressed. And he says that when he had nothing to do, he used to go to Boral, to the location. And I'm reading, because I can't read it entirely, I'm reading here something like this, that yes, that how he started listening to the space. Pather Pachali content many scenes that we realize would have to be bolstered with the addition of sound effects, if not music. That meant a survey of possible sources of sound in a rural setting. Bird calls could be used, especially when there were trees in the vicinity, but only up to a point. Otherwise, monotony would result. In the time that we waited for the money, I went back to the village with my ears open and made a note of the sound effects which would be used. The breeze over a bamboo grove could make the tall bamboo sway with the morning music. A breeze over a lotus pond caused the flapping of the lotus leaves. To suggest morning, there were the early bird calls, the cawing of the crow. For instance, while evening resounded with far and near sounds of conch shells and the chirping of the crickets. Late nights were ushered in by the hoots of owls and the howling of jackals. An important sound in the evening in the story is the sound of a distant railway train, which is brought nearer on just one occasion. Evenings were marked by singing, much favored by the Bengalis, to the accompaniment of the box harmonium. All these I noted down as I waited for the resumption of work. If you come back, sorry. Here we see that someone who is not only learning to see, and why did I say that the camera is a bad metaphor? Because by 2020, the camera is no more an apparatus to look, no more an apparatus to just observe. It's also, camera means also CCTV. Camera means also surveillance. Yes, the sound equipment also means eavesdropping. But here the sound, the notion of sound, the notion of hearing is actually showing that how one is opening up to another reality altogether. So why is this poignant in 2020? This going out there and going out of one's own self, going out of one's own certainties, one's own assurances, what makes one actually if not important, but viable in a cultural scene. Uh, and one is going out of it, out of the comfort zone, into places and letting that place write itself on the film. So one becomes a facilitator of reality out there by actually minimalizing or erasing oneself and letting life write it on its own into the celluloid strip. Why is it important in 2020? Because I think in 2020, or in the years which was preceding it, I think 2020 actually is a time when many things which were surreptitiously being formed in the yesteryears, it is coming into palpable visibility. That this neat division of our locked down state between indoors and outdoors, this also is poignant. This also means a lot. Because throughout the world, in the last couple of decades or so, politics has been largely about this inside and outside. Politics is largely about defining each country in its own insiders viewers and shutting itself off to the outside. And we remember that the president of America's rather dogmatic speeches against the immigrants, against refugees, how entire Europe is actually trying to shut it off to the refugees, to the influxes of refugees from Syria, and how within our country also, that not only there is this notion of India becoming that of insiders, but also marking people. And when the pandemic came in, we were right into this situation when we were marking people within the country as outsiders, as people who are not probably this kind of the insiders of the country at all. So that this inside outside binary, which we right now we are suffering, if one can say lockdown was suffering, we were in a state of lockdown. Before that, we were culturally and politically in a state of lockdown. And what is unfortunate also, and this is my personal opinion, that this structure of understanding politics, this structure of politics is also something which is heavily marking even the progressive politics also. So in recent days, not only the dominant identitarian politics of the nations, of Trump's America, of our India, of Boris Johnson's England, or so on and so forth, and places, or the right-wing tendencies everywhere in the world. But also in the progressive politics, we see a kind of tendency to mark an inside based on to mark an identity based on inside, a kind of identity which one holds on to, and then one becoming hostile to the outside. And this inside, the identity of the inside, it becomes like a fortress, and you tend to kind of consider the outer world, the outside of that identity, as a hostile place, because this is largely the template of the right-wing identity and politics of this times. Here, when one is saying that one is trying to leave the sense of self and going outside the sense of self and trying to understand the other, what does this mean in one word? It means empathy. So Rai's cinema was a cinema of empathy. Well, and now if we go back to those writings by Glushanov and Klaus, it will become most probably more evident to us why compassion and empathy is something which was so important for the kind of humanist realism which they valued so much in Rai's cinema. This notion of empathy, this notion of going outside from our boundaries to the outer. It might be the outer of the self, it might be the outer of the nation, it might be the outer of the class, or so on and so forth. One has to, and one can't say one is appropriating the other, because there is continuously, there is this sense that one might know the other entirely, and one might even have the traces of the inside in here, that is the self in one's work. Because I don't have much time left because of the elective failures and other things, I think this is being lengthened, but one can discuss mainly films like Charulata and so on and so forth. I am recalling films which starred Madhavi Mukherjee and Karuna Bandyopadhyay, where we will see that this actors who were actually portraying very modern women, by the end of the film, and I am particularly recalling Sarboja in Aparajito and Charulata and Madhavi Mukherjee in Charulata or Kapurush or films like that, where the woman slowly and slowly becomes kind of unreadable and opaque in the film. That is, there are lots of things which are happening behind their visage, behind their faces, but we don't actually know what's happening there. So we understand that cinema is not trying to appropriate the other self. It's not trying to know the other self in its entirety, but this is a gesture, and this is what I'm saying is a realist gesture. This is, I think this is more poignant nowadays in the cinema of nowadays, because all kind of alternative cinema, or I don't like Bengali cinema much, but the few films which I like, made in recent times, in the last 2 decades or so, I can recall one particular film where the director makes a film entirely, mixing fiction, non-fiction, realism and fantasy. He makes a film on the place of his childhood. That is, in other words, his inside. That is the place which you know. This is a trap of cinema in these days. That is, you make films about things which you know, about things of yourself. You make films about yourself, about your peer group, about the society you are in, about the places which you know, rather than going out there. And here I think this gesture, or realist gesture of Satyajit Ray, becomes very important in Pather Pachili. This kind of valiant, almost heroic kind of gesture to step outside the comfort zone of not only one's imagination, but also one's grooming, one peer group, one's being, after all. I can't say that Satyajit could have maintained this position throughout his career. That's a different question altogether. That's a different question. But I exactly wanted to, and here I wanted to evaluate. I want to understand the nuances of this moment of Pather Pachili, why it's so important, and why it might be important to the cine lovers all over the world, and why it might be valuable during this time also, during 2020, when the inside and the outside of the world become so kind of delimited, and we are actually trapped within ourselves. I think I can stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Anindya, for your wonderful talk, which has not just been perceptive, but also excitingly ambitious. We are indebted to you for expanding this horizon of wry criticism from mere formal and aesthetic discussions to more historical concerns. Uh, it has certainly made us more aware of the correspondence between Rai's works and our own historical and political condition in 2020 in both spatial as well as temporal terms. Well, I could just go on and on, but before I take up the rest of the time, I guess we have to move on to the question answer session. We had asked the members of the audience to type in their questions in the chat box, I would now like to request my colleague, Mr. Supratik Surroy, to moderate the Q&A session. Supratik, if you would take over, please. Thank you.
Arup, I think I have another kind of request that since the entire lecture was in English, if someone wishes to, they can actually ask questions in Bangla. But I don't want someone, if one is more comfortable in asking questions in Bangla, let them do it.
I guess that's pretty self-explanatory, so I don't need to repeat anything.
Yeah.
Good evening, Anindya. The first question that we have received from our Professor Tathagato Sen from English department, who is also the IQSC coordinator and the honorary advisor of the film club. So he's asking you that would you say that from an artist motivated primarily by comparison, he shifted to Brechtian didactism
Motivated
in the last 3 or 4 films, adversely affecting the aesthetics of his work?
I think you kind of mispronounced. He actually meant compassion rather than comparison. Nevertheless,
sorry.
I understand. I understand this question. The last 3 to 4 films of Rai is not actually, it's not satisfactory to us because of this didacticism. I would not term it Brechtian as such, because I have to think of it. I would like to term it as Brechtian, but it's didacticism surely. But what is important to me is even this lesser films. I consider the last few from Ghore Baire till Aguntuk, his films as lesser films, not films which I would like to visit often now and then. But what I find actually how I find these films valuable is in his kind of earnestness. He was actually trying to warn us about this steady growth of right-wing politics in India, the Hinduist politics, because Ghore Baire and Ganashutru was about it, and the later 2 films, Shaka Proshaka and Aguntuk, they kind of expanded into what he thinks is the ills of the civilization. But he was not in the best of his health. He was not in the best of his form. The films were not up to the mark. Of course, one has to admit that. But I can't actually feel the earnest desperation which the artist was suffering at the fag end of his life.
Okay. The second question is asked by Raju Roy Chaudhary, and he's saying, thanks Anindya for articulating the in or out duality in such a beautiful fashion through the lens of Ray. Can you please share Ghushanok's article on Ray that appeared on Cineaste in 1967?
Oh, I can't actually give it. You can find it in Gesture. Okay, if you just it's not Ghushanok, it's Glushanok, GLU. If you type Paul Glushanok and Satyajit Ray in Gesture, you will find 2 articles on Ray, and I think you will get it.
And also Ayush is asking, sir, do you think this blurring of the fine line of difference between illusion and reality bolster or make our day-to-day lives easier or all the more complicated?
This question is not actually related to Rai, but I will relate it to Rai. I will try to relate it to Rai. Because a few days I was thinking that we actually thought that the way we thought about cinema, and this the Brechtian thing now comes into kind of consideration, that when we thought about modernist cinema, we often thought about the presence of the apparatus as something detrimental. Sorry, not the presence of the apparatus, but hiding of the apparatus as something detrimental. That how actually in Brechtian aesthetics, the apparatus which is making the art possible, it was actually it was foregrounded, and we gave it a kind of new kind of value. And the previous kind of realist films which actually hides the apparatus, we give it a lesser kind of cultural value during those times. But now I'm thinking of revising it in a kind of way, because think of it, think of the way you were seeing me, the way you are seeing me through an interface of the Google Meet, the webinar Google Meet. And whenever we speak on the phone, the lack of network, etc., one can say that our communication between the self and the other is always heavily mediated by technology. And the presence of the apparatus is always there. You can't wish it away. You can't wish away the interface. You can't actually think of this the way you are watching me. You can't think that the scrolling chats here and the other buttons, etc., they just vanish. They won't go away. The medium is here to stay. So medium, then to relate it to your line, actually the medium is the reality. The medium becomes the reality which enables partially reality to us when we encounter the image these days. So in that sense, race kind of realism, which tries to, and the way actually Paul Glushanok and John Flaws, they actually discuss that how he kept the formal devices minimal, how he kept the formal devices less spectacular. In that way, Godard's films are very spectacular in its kind of foregrounding of the apparatus. How a race kind of cinema, a more humble kind of cinema, keeps the presence of the camera and the entire apparatus, how it makes it less spectacular and less kind of foreboding to us. I think looking back at Pather Pachali and cinema per se as we knew it, it gives us a new kind of value. When we look at it from 2020, when the presence of the medium is always demonically, one can say, in a gargantuan fashion, is always there. We always are aware that we are not having access to reality, but we are having access to a mediatized reality. To answer that.
So Shayantan Dotto has asked that Ray was asked many times why he was not making films on the question of working class or so, or at the time of 70s, on the question of Naxalite revolutionaries. How do you consider this? Was he not able to efface himself in front of the ultra-left rebel identity? Portraying their cause and anxieties. His films were mainly centered on the middle-class people like himself.
Yeah, yes. Now, I can recall that day before yesterday in the last webinar, actually, I encountered a very interesting question which I didn't have any answer to. And I will add that question to this. And there was one scholar who was asking me that why didn't, since Ray was dealing so much with the middle class Bengali, why is Ray not doing any films about the Muslim middle class Bengali? And this is, I think, it's not a criticism, it is a question. Why is he not doing it? And not only Satyajit, even Ritik Katok is not doing it. And no major filmmakers, they are doing it during those times. So I am not talking only about the ultra left or the working class or so on, or this kind of section of the society, but also a big section of the society. Because Bengalis are not only Hindus, Bengalis are Muslims too. So here I think this question cannot be very easily answered. But I think one of the ethics of the realism of race time was that one would also not venture into, because one is armed with the apparatus which is very powerful, the camera. Camera shows things. One will not venture into a zone, a space where which one cannot know. So here comes another interesting distinction. The other which is partially knowable and the other which is not knowable because of the self. And most probably, and I think, uh, if you understand Rai, how Rai works, Rai was a bi-authorial author. Bi-authorial author in the sense that Rai waits for someone, for mainly for a novelist, who will give a kind of, will give an account of a reality which is known through first-hand experience by that novelist. So the important point is that Rai didn't have a rural childhood like Bibhuti Bhushan, but Bibhuti Bhushan had. So Satyajit Ray is someone who is always wait for a source material. So he will wait for someone to depict a, a, a space, a group of people, a milieu in a certain kind of way, and only then can he actually undertake a kind of critical take of his own. So most probably, I would say that we don't know, because we can't actually imagine how he was working, that in the question of working class or the Naxalite revolutionaries, the insiders of the Naxalite revolutionaries, so on and so forth. Most probably, he was also waiting for primary source materials which he never got. And also, I think for an artist like Rai, what most probably have irritated or irked him was preconceived notions. That when you approach a reality with preconceived notions. Now, this is true not only about the Muslim society, the Muslim middle class or Muslim working class society, but also working class, but also the Naxalites. That we have preconceived notions. So we will approach them either as a filmmaker or as the author with preconceived notions. So on and so forth. But this is something which I can if I can actually attempt to answer. I'm sure I'm not answering it properly, entirely rather.
Okay. So the next question is asked by Arubda, our colleague. Your talk has given an insight into a much needed practice of reappraisal of classics. These practices of reading always open up new horizons of meaning. However, it is also true for classics that the sheer volume of discourse accumulated around them over the years often creates an obstacle to such practices of new readings. Can you please comment on this apparent conundrum?
These days I'm starting to look at artwork in a different kind of way. That is, what is a work of art, and therefore what is a classic work of art, one can say. Previously, I thought that a classic work of art is a snapshot of reality, might be a snapshot of imagination, might be a window to the world. I'm thinking of the realist kind of novels or films or so on and so forth. It's a recording of the world in a certain kind of way. It's a window to another world in a certain kind of way. But I these days I fuse this notion of the realist artwork with a kind of modernist sensibility and try to understand these works as something which is added to our world. They are presences. And Anna Karenina by Tolstoy is something which was added to our world. A Pather Pachali, the novel, is added to our world. The film is added to our world. So these things are like monuments, actually. They are like architectures which you can visit because they exist in your world. And so when you encounter them, you are always encountering them at your time. Not You do, when you visit Qutub Minar, you are, or Taj Mahal, you are not visiting Qutub Minar or Taj Mahal during that time. Though there is a time warp definitely happens. Definitely when you encounter Taj Mahal, you feel that you are, there is a time warp and you are taken back to that time when the Taj Mahal has been just been built. And that happens in works of art. But we always encounter works of art from our time. So when we understand works of art from our time, will always we should always make it meaning in our context. If I look at his question more carefully, he says that, however, it is also true for classics that the sheer volume of discourse accumulated around them over the years. So he says that the Taj Mahal is not only the Taj Mahal, but the Taj Mahal is also surrounding by opinions about Taj Mahal also. We don't, and so this, sometimes our eyes needs to be cleansed as such. We must think something without the trappings, and I think that we actually encounter work of art without its trappings, not in ordinary times, but in extraordinary times like the year 2020. Because the year 2020 is a time of crisis. The year 2020 is a time of calamity. At this moment, we actually look at things in its raw bareness, and our work of art would be one that kind of thing. So there will be moments when these readings will gather and make meaning, and there will be moments when this reading will demand a more unmediated, where the discourses are mediations. These works of art, they invite a more unmediated encounter with it during this time of crisis. Because when when the pandemic started, I thought that cinema, this is the kind of end of cinema. Cinema as I know it, because I don't consider cinema mediated via other medium like television or internet access, actually is cinema as such. It's video. You are not watching me in a film, you are watching me in a video. So the experience of cinema most probably has ended the way we knew it. So this is the time when you not only way you reappraise kind of cinema also in a certain kind of way. Because what today I was trying to contemplate upon, that what cinema does, not only what Satyajit did, but what cinema does as such. So there are times when we need to go to the classics without the discourses, There are moments like this do appear.
Okay, so many have asked you about that, what lack in the contemporary Bangla cinema, and with that I would like to also ask you that, as you have mentioned about the empathy, like when Ray is manifesting Opu's life or the lives in Nishchindepur, he's showing it in the empathical way. Do you think that we, I mean, in the contemporary Bangla cinema, or rather in Indian cinema, this point of empathy is constantly being missed, apart from a few films like Shohoj Pather Goppo, maybe, or maybe in Aditya Vikram Sengupta, and whereas we are kind of moving towards more and more to the sympathy part rather than manifestation of the empathy.
Yeah. Now this needs philosophical backing, that how we define empathy and sympathy, because that's not something to actually comment constructively, to comment in a substantial way, when one needs to go back to philosophy actually. And I'm not that well read in philosophy. I can guess certain answers. To answer that, one is definitely, I think that contemporary cinema, even the best of contemporary Indian or Bengali cinema, they are trapped into the milieu of the self. Here the self is the artist. The milieu of the self. We talk about ourselves, we talk about places we know, we talk about places we are in. in that kind of our troubles and so on and so forth. We think that's a problem, and also something which I am recently thinking, that the lineage of modernity, the lineage of modernism, and here I am talking about a certain break in the temporal paradigm, that we had been in a previous temporal paradigm, but now we are in another temporal paradigm altogether. That the modernism gave us, and here I seemed sometimes lacking the modernist age in a certain kind of way. The modernism was about the brutalization of the senses, and brutalization as such. And brutalization had been, I think, had been too kind of overvalued in art, and we have actually learned, we have we we have actually kind of forgot to contemplate on empathy as such. Why I'm saying that brutalization is overvalued? Because if I think of a a filmmaker I like, I think of Anurag Kashyap. Anurag Kashyap, I like his films very much. He makes films about a reality which he hates, and he actually presents them in a hateful kind of way. And this is what the best filmmakers do during this time. Because they have this modernist impulse to shock us with brutality. But I think that the whole point is missed, but just for the simple reason, because we are now in a mediatized environment where people love, they enjoy brutality. If you think, if you just scroll down your Facebook timeline, and if you have an eclectic choice of Facebook friends, and if there are people who share too many things, then you will, each third post or image or video you will encounter is about brutality, is about brutalization of the society, it's about brutalization of the humankind. So people, if we, and why aren't we leaving the social media? Why are we not shutting ourselves off from the social media and from the internet or others? Because somewhere deep inside we are so accustomed with the present of the brutalization that we have started enjoying brutality as such, and there is a brutal world out there, and we have come into terms with it, that it's there to stay. And therefore, in this sense, I think the brutalization as a kind of aesthetic political weapon, I think the day of its effectivity has ended. Because an artist, one needs to be a very powerful artist to even shock or disturb the middle class who enjoys brutality. The middle class who enjoys, which wallows in brutality, to shock them and to kind of defamiliarize their and make films like the way Michael Haneke does. I think it's gone. The time is gone. Even another favorite filmmaker of mine, that countering the brutality of the bourgeois with more aesthetic brutality, I think the time is gone. So we think we need to rethink about this term called empathy. And empathy to me is this notion when you try to reach out to the other without ever knowing her, in that sense. Think of this situation. You see someone crying on the streets. So would you be empathetic with him or her by knowing her backstory, by why is she crying, by what kind of person she is, or something like that, or something. Maybe she doesn't need your help also, but your act of you're looking at her kind of should have a degree of empathy and compassion, and not any action. Something which John Flaws says, that this kind of rise cinema is not saying that act now. You don't need to go and help her. She's most probably on her own. But suddenly she's on her own, but she's so perturbed that she's crying in the streets. She doesn't need your help. At that time, you cannot know her. Your action and your knowledge cannot appropriate her state. You cannot even know why she's doing this and what she's doing. All you can do is look at her with a kind of empathy and compassion. And this empathy and compassion means going somewhere in between, out of yourself, but not reaching that other. I think cinema is a medium, unlike other medium, which can do this, which can go in this middle zone, out of the self and not exactly appropriating the other, stays somewhere between. Cinema could have the best of cinema can actually do this.
Thank you, Anindya. Now let's wrap up this question and answer session, and I'll pass the baton to Shoumo for the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to begin by extending our heartfelt thanks to Dr. Anindya Sengupta, who not only delivered a stimulating lecture, but also gave an exciting start to our celebrations of Satyajit Ray's centenary. We truly look forward to having you with us again in the future. Our most sincere thanks and gratitude goes to Dr. Suchandra Chakraborty, our respected teacher in charge, who kindly took time out of her busy schedule to encourage us with her presence and her words. We are deeply thankful to our respected Vice Principal, Professor Devjani Ganguly, who has always motivated us in all sorts of departmental activities and has played an instrumental role in starting the film club. I must take this opportunity to thank Professor Tathagata Sen, the IQAC coordinator of our college, whose enthusiasm and prompt response have truly made all of these easy and effortless for us. No word is enough to express the appreciation for the management body of our college for their keen interest and support for organizing academic events such as these. Of course, one must acknowledge the efforts of esteemed colleagues, Ms. Roktima Ghosh, Ms. Srimoy Roy, Mr. Supratik Shur Roy, and Mr. Harupratam Samajdar, who had put in their round-the-clock efforts to ensure the success of this event. It is not only unfair, but impossible to conclude this without mentioning our students, whose zeal and excitement continue to inspire us in all our activities, within and outside of classrooms. In the context of this event, I must mention the names of our student coordinators, Riddhodev Bandhopadhyay and Shaurodipto Roy, and Ishani Bose, who had designed the poster. Finally, last but not the least, we extend our thanks and gratitude to the participants whose presence has indeed validated all of our efforts of these past few days. It has been wonderful to have you all here, and we look forward to many more exciting and riveting interactive sessions in the days and months to come. A kind request to all of you before you leave, the link to the feedback form has been given in the chat box. It will be active till 12 a.m. 29th August. Please fill it up in order to receive the certificate. Thank you, and I think we are signing off from here.